Good evening. It has been a long week, a 1,500-day week, to be precise, since former President Trump declared Infrastructure Week. Tonight, under a new president, we are inching closer to an infrastructure deal on Capitol Hill, and with it, a new generation of public works in America with mended bridges and decontaminated water and steadier Wi-Fi. Any moment now, the Senate is set to vote on a pair of key procedural motions. The first, on an amendment that adds the final text of the bipartisan bill. The second vote is on cloture to end debate on the bill. If all that happens, we should expect to see a final vote on Tuesday morning. But if all 100 senators agree to move things faster, we could see a final vote even sooner. I will let you know if that happens. And coming up, I'll ask Congressman Jamal Bowman about what happens next in the House. But first, this was supposed to be our hot vaxxed summer. Instead, it has become a summer of chilling omens. Wildfire smoke wafted from sea to shining sea, the apocalyptic weather making plain that climate change can no longer be spoken of as a future threat. A once mellowing virus surged back to life, preying on willful and cynically manufactured ignorance. New facts surfaced about just how close America came to a coup in 2020. In just the last day, we learned the Senate Judiciary Committee interviewed former Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen about former President Trump's efforts to use the Department of Justice to overturn the results of the election. Senator Richard Blumenthal sits on that committee. Here's what he told MSNBC.
Let me be very blunt. The President of the United States, then Donald Trump, mounted a pressure campaign that was absolutely relentless, brutal, personally involved, directly aimed at the Department of Justice, seeking to break it and weaponize it to overthrow the election. I want to put aside talking about specific individuals. But I will say, as a former United States attorney and a state attorney general for 20 years, there's a real potential here for criminal charges. They should be seriously considered.
And meanwhile, a growing chorus of on-the-ground reporters and writers and scholars began sounding the alarm about 2024. Their message? If present trends continue and if nothing is done, the next presidential election could be stolen. Legally stolen. These are not the cries of extremely online provocateurs. They are fact-based warnings about what is actually happening right now in states across this country. The scenario these experts warn of isn't one of guns and tanks and the seizure of TV stations and leaders and unfortunate berets, which may be a redundant phrase. You see, we are trained by Hollywood and by our memory of world events to recognize the telltale signs of democracy under assault. But if democracy dies in America, it is unlikely to resemble our mental picture. That death would be, the experts tell us, completely above board, fully legal, even constitutional. The I's will be dotted, the T's will be crossed, the paperwork will be submitted properly and on time in triplicate. And we know this. I can say this to you tonight on good authority because the legal maneuvers, the dotting and crossing, the filling out of paperwork, it's all happening now, a full 3 years in advance. The assault on 2024 is a crock-pot coup, simmering low and slow undercover, breaking down the fibers of our electoral system until one day democracy itself is cooked. In Arizona, as meticulously reported by Jane Mayer in The New Yorker, the crock-pot coup looks like a phony audit of the 2020 election results, funded by private donors, many of them out of state, with a view to giving Arizona a pretext, now or in the future, to throw out a legitimate electoral result, citing bogus claims of voter fraud. As Mayer writes, it's a surprisingly short leap from making accusations of voter fraud to calling for the nullification of a supposedly tainted election. In Georgia, the Republican-controlled legislature passed a law giving itself the power to replace county election boards, and officials have already initiated a process that could lead to a takeover of elections in Fulton County, a Democratic stronghold. Indeed, Republicans have introduced more than 400 legislative proposals in 49 states to make voting more difficult, including threats of criminal prosecution for local election officials who violate these rules. At least 30 of these bills have already passed. The various expressions of this slow, simmering coup appear to share a common object, laying the groundwork for states to declare their own election systems to have been contaminated by fraud, and thereby usurping from the people the power to allocate electoral votes. In short, these states are creating a legal framework to do what former President Trump asked them to do in 2020, overturn their own elections. The cynically, tragicomically Orwellian name for these Republican machinations? Election integrity. Election integrity. If democracy does ultimately die in America, it will be election integrity that did it. What is the answer to this crockpot coup? Urgent, concerted democratic reform. Quote, to save our democracy, we must democratize it. The scholars Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky write. We must expand access to the ballot, reform our electoral system to ensure that majorities win elections, and weaken or eliminate antiquated institutions such as the filibuster so that majorities can actually govern. Radical idea. Amid the summer of the Delta variant and of those wildfires and of looming evictions and a last-ditch moratorium on those evictions and the possibility that we will, at long last, have our infrastructure weak, the crockpot coup may feel at once less immediate and more daunting. But perhaps no other ongoing story in this country so deserves our attention. That you and I are even having this conversation right now doesn't fit the picture of America that many of us were raised with. We are accustomed to thinking of this country as immune to those kinds of forces. But of course we aren't. My first guest tonight grew up in the Soviet Union, fled to America as the child of a refugee family seeking freedom and equality, only to collide decades later here in America with the corrupt officialdom and politics of reprisal and democratic sabotage that his family had been escaping.
Dad, my sitting here today in the U.S. Capitol talking to our elected officials is proof that you made the right decision 40 years ago to leave the Soviet Union and come here to the United States of America in search of a better life for our family. Do not worry, I'll be fine for telling the truth. Congressman, because this is America. This is the country I've served and defended, that all of my brothers have served, and here, right matters.
Retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman testified at Trump's first impeachment trial about the former president's dealings with Ukraine. That testimony inspired the title of his new book, Here, Right Matters. His work and life testifies to a faith in America's essential goodness and democratic mooring. But what does the phrase, Here, Right Matters, mean after January 6th? What does it mean in this current moment in which the loss of American democracy is a serious conversation? Former Director of European Affairs for the U.S. National Security Council, retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, joins me now. Thank you so much for joining me. I want to start with the title of your book, Here, Right Matters. When you testified in Congress, that phrase won a nation's heart. It spoke to your family's finding in America freedoms it had lacked in the Soviet Union. But you have lived to see anti-democratic forces follow you here, and your confidence in right mattering here seems to be in tension with the democratic backsliding we're witnessing in this country and that you saw up close. Does right really matter here in some special, unique way?
Thank you for having me on. I think it does. I think this country is very unique. In addition to my decades of military service, I served in some really difficult environments in countries where democracy didn't exist or was under great pressure. And I could see the contrast between those countries and the United States. Frankly, it's something important to mention is that President Trump was the chief executive. His party controlled one of the houses in Congress, and he failed to steal the election. I think we have, under a Democratic administration, Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate, the probability has decreased that there'll be that any forces will be able to completely upend our democracy. But we should be vigilant. One of the reasons I'm speaking about this is there is a sense of complacency that things will return back to normal, that our democracy is no longer under threat. That is not true. As you pointed out, there are forces in play that are purely self-serving, that are looking to hold on to a America that doesn't really exist anymore, an America dominated by a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant population that wants to retain its grip on power. There is nothing wrong with the country that it has become more heterogeneous, more of a melting pot, more representative, and the power has shifted to represent that population. I think that's the fear that the Republicans are preying on. We are not out of danger, but this country is under threat. I still have faith that we're going to continue to move towards that more perfect union.
As a father and a son myself, both, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in the book your father's decision to leave the Soviet Union. You wrote that the more he rose in that system, the more he realized that the whole thing was a complex of quid pro quo backroom deal-making. Your family came to the U.S. as refugees to escape that, but you found yourself witness to America's own version of quid pro quos. Talk to me about how your family history informed your choice to be a whistleblower, how your father's experience of truth-telling in one system informed yours in another.
It's interesting that you put it as informed my decision to be a whistleblower. In fact, I didn't necessarily recognize that I was going to be a whistleblower. My intent was to report wrongdoing and live up to my oath of office and my oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I was doing what so many other public servants have done repeatedly. We've seen these cases where presidential wrongdoing under the previous administration has unfolded, and there have been checks on the system. So, in fact, I would say that this is not necessarily something that's purely driven by unique experiences. A lot of different people are in government trying to do the right thing. In my case, I did have some very important experiences. Those experiences come back from my deep background as an immigrant to the United States. They include military service under difficult conditions in countries that don't have democracy, and as a foreign policy analyst, studying Russia, studying Ukraine, studying Eastern Europe, and understanding how those systems fell apart towards tyranny, authoritarianism. I think all of that, in my case, informed my decision on an understanding of what risks our country faced, both at that moment and now.
You have served under Republican and Democratic officials, presidents in uniform. What would you say to the large chunk of Republican officialdom? We're not talking about lay people on the streets, but high officials at the state and federal level who appear to be going in this direction of overturning democracy as a litmus test for being a good faith member of their party.
We see you. We recognize the threat you pose, and we are watching you, and we will take action against you. When I say this, this is my call to arms. Here right matters only if we make it matter. We need to make sure that all of the people that failed to live up to their obligations, that were complicit in January 6th, that failed to hold accountable a president that was corrupt and was abusing his power, energized the president, enabled him to continue to press to steal our democracy. And we know who those people are, and I'm going to do everything in my power, and I encourage everybody that's watching the show, everybody that cares for this democracy, to be equally as active in defending this democracy and voting in people that will live up to their obligations, voting in people that take their oath to defend the Constitution of the United States and preserve this democracy seriously.
Retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who knows what he speaks of when he speaks of authoritarianism. Thank you for your time tonight.